The They asked me to do it, and I was anxious to do some live appearances.
In his final days, Elvis Presley had 5 separate conversations that nobody recognized as significant at the time. A laugh with his ex-wife, a phone call to a stranger he admired, a strange warning to his stepbrother, a small exchange with his father, and a simple goodbye to his cousin, hours before he died. None of them sounded like an ending. Today, join us as we go through exactly what he said, in his own words, to the people who spoke with him last. The laugh she hadn't heard in a while.
There's so much stuff out there, you know, about my life, about Elvis's life, about our life, about, you know, people in our lives.
A few days before, August the 16th, 1977, Priscilla Presley picked up the phone to a familiar voice. Her former husband calling the way he sometimes did, with no particular urgency behind the call itself. Their marriage had ended 5 years earlier, but the relationship that followed surprised many people close to both of them. Despite everything that had happened, the affair, the death threat against Mike Stone that Priscilla would only reveal publicly decades later, the painful final months of their marriage, the two had settled into something calmer and more genuinely caring once the divorce was finalized. Their daughter, Lisa Marie, remained the central thread connecting them, but the relationship itself had evolved into something closer to real friendship, freed from the pressures that had defined them as husband and wife. This particular call, recounted later in Priscilla's memoir, Elvis and Me, touched on nothing especially dramatic. Elvis was preparing for an upcoming tour, 12 dates scheduled to begin within days. He told her about it with obvious good spirits, the kind of casual, easy energy that had once defined so much of his personality before the accumulated weight of his final years had worn it down. He brought up Colonel Tom Parker, his longtime manager, with a tone of amused, long-suffering affection. The Colonel had, as usual, papered the first city on the tour with promotional posters well in advance, and Presley's records were already playing constantly on local radio ahead of his arrival. The same promotional formula Parker had relied on for over 2 decades. Elvis found this genuinely funny. "Good old Colonel," he said. "We've come a long way. He's still putting out that same old stuff. It's a wonder people are still buying it." He laughed as he said it. Priscilla, recalling the conversation later, specifically noted this detail, the sound of him laughing, because it had become something she heard from him less and less by that point in his life. The years of declining health, the isolation, the accumulated strain Priscilla had witnessed even from a distance during their post-divorce relationship had visibly worn down the easy humor that had once come so naturally to him. This small observation carries considerable weight when placed against everything else known about his final months. Friends and family throughout 1977 had described a man increasingly withdrawn, increasingly burdened, prone to long stretches of isolation and conversations that circled back toward fear, betrayal, and exhaustion. A genuine, easy laugh, the kind Priscilla specifically recalled hearing during this final call, stood out precisely because it had become rare enough to notice and remember. The conversation itself reflected the broader pattern of their post-divorce relationship. Comfortable, familiar, and built on years of shared history that neither painful memory nor the passage of time had fully erased. They discussed the tour. They discussed Parker's promotional habits with the kind of inside joke familiarity only 2 people with decades of shared experience could manage. Nothing in the conversation suggested either of them sensed anything unusual approaching. This ordinariness matters enormously to understanding the full picture of Presley's final days. Popular retellings of tragic deaths sometimes search retroactively for foreboding, for signs that should have been recognized, for conversations that, viewed afterward, seem to carry hidden warning. Priscilla's account of this final call resists that kind of retroactive drama. It was, by every detail she has shared, simply an ordinary, pleasant conversation between 2 people who had built something genuine and lasting out of the wreckage of their marriage. What makes the memory significant is not anything said directly, but the specific texture Priscilla noticed and chose to preserve in her own retelling. The laugh, the lightness, and a glimpse, however brief, of the person he had been before the accumulated weight of his final years had settled so heavily onto him. Priscilla has spoken about this call publicly on several occasions since first writing about it in her 1985 memoir. She has never claimed to have sensed anything ominous during the conversation itself. What she has consistently emphasized instead is the specific value of that particular moment. In retrospect, a final glimpse of warmth and humor between two people who had genuinely cared for each other across decades of complicated, evolving relationship. This call occurred only days before his death, placing it among the final handful of conversations he would have with anyone close to him. Priscilla's account, preserved carefully in her own writing and repeated in subsequent interviews over the following decades, represents one of the clearest, most directly documented final exchanges available from his last days, offering a specific human moment that complicates the simpler, more clinical accounts of medication records and toxicology reports that dominate so much of the broader historical record surrounding his death. It was, by Priscilla's own description, simply Elvis being Elvis one more time, warm, funny, and affectionately exasperated with Colonel Parker's old habits. A small, ordinary moment that neither of them recognized in that instant as one of the last conversations they would ever share. Within days, a stranger on the other end of a different phone call would hear something considerably less light in his voice. A man who introduced himself simply as Elvis Aaron Presley, reaching out for connection in a way that revealed just how much weight he was actually carrying underneath that laugh Priscilla had been so glad to hear again. The stranger who picked up the phone.
And then one day he gave me the telephone. And this is Elvis Aaron Presley. I just want to tell you that you make me feel, I'm thinking.
In his final days, Elvis Presley reached out to someone he had never actually met. British pop singer Leo Sayer, known for hits including You Make Me Feel Like Dancing and When I Need You, picked up his phone to a voice he did not immediately recognize. The call came through unexpectedly, arranged somehow through Presley's circle, though the exact path connecting the two men has never been fully detailed publicly. When the voice on the line introduced itself, Sayer assumed it was a joke. He thought briefly that the caller might actually be Terry O'Neill, a photographer friend known for his uncanny celebrity impressions. Sayer asked directly, half amused, whether this was Terry pulling a prank. "No, sir," the voice replied. "This is Elvis Aaron Presley." What followed surprised Sayer considerably, both in the moment and even more so in retrospect.
Terry, it's you. Terry, no, get off. But no, it was actually, no, sir, I swear to you, I am he.
Presley explained that someone in his circle, a masseuse named Michael, had spoken highly of Sayer, describing him as a great guy. Then Presley said something that revealed far more than a simple compliment. He told Sayer he was going through a bit of a hole in his life himself, that things were not going particularly well, and that he had only his girlfriend with him at Graceland. He invited Sayer to come hang out, to see what they could create together, explaining that he loved Sayer's songs and believed he could be a good source of energy during a difficult period. This detail carries enormous weight specifically because of how directly it contradicts the careful, controlled public image Presley typically maintained, even in his most difficult final years. He was not simply making polite conversation with a fellow musician. He was, by Sayer's own account, openly acknowledging genuine personal struggle to someone he had never met in person, someone with no prior relationship or established trust between them. The two spoke for approximately half an hour. Sayer later described the conversation as warm and genuine throughout, noting that Presley came across as humble and sweet, genuinely enthusiastic about the possibility of collaboration and connection. There was no trace in Sayer's recollection of arrogance or celebrity distance. Just a man reaching out, somewhat unexpectedly, for exactly the kind of creative and personal connection he apparently felt was missing from his life at that specific moment. If the story had ended there, this conversation might have simply become a charming footnote, an older legend reaching out to embrace a younger artist's energy, the kind of generous, collaborative spirit that occasionally surfaces in music industry history. Instead, before Sayer ever had the opportunity to actually travel to Memphis and take Presley up on his invitation, news broke that Elvis Presley had died. This timing transformed an already meaningful conversation into something considerably more haunting in retrospect. Sayer has described the unsettling quality of this realization clearly in subsequent interviews. The sense that Presley's own words, going through a bit of a hole, things not being good, seeking outside energy to pull himself through, took on a weight neither man could have recognized in the moment itself. Sayer faced an additional complication in the aftermath of this call that further obscured its place in the historical record for years afterward. His wife at the time, Janice Lissitor, advised him not to share the story publicly, worried that people would assume he was either fabricating the connection or simply name-dropping for personal benefit. Sayer has described how this advice affected him directly, leading him to begin doubting his own memory of the conversation, wondering if perhaps he had imagined or exaggerated the entire exchange. This doubt persisted for years until a chance dinner brought unexpected confirmation. Sayer found himself sharing a meal with record producer David Foster and, remarkably, Ginger Alden herself, the same girlfriend Presley had specifically mentioned during their phone call. Alden, without any prompting connected to Sayer's own private uncertainty, told him directly what Presley's actual last words had been before she discovered him the following morning, confirming details that aligned precisely with what Presley had described to Sayer during their own conversation days earlier. This unexpected confirmation finally validated, for Sayer personally, a memory he had spent years doubting under his own scrutiny. The phone call had genuinely happened. The vulnerability Presley had shown, a global superstar admitting openly to a stranger that he was struggling and needed connection, had been real, not imagined or exaggerated through the distorting lens of retrospective grief or self-importance. This particular conversation offers something distinct from Priscilla's call days earlier, where Priscilla's exchange revealed a flash of familiar warmth and humor. Presley's call to Sayer revealed something raw and more directly vulnerable, an explicit acknowledgement of genuine struggle, offered to someone with no prior relationship, no established trust, nothing beyond Presley's own apparent need to reach outward toward whatever connection and energy he believed might help pull him through whatever he was actually experiencing during those final days. Taken together, these two calls suggest a man capable, even in his final days, of both genuine lightness and genuine, openly acknowledged struggle, sometimes within the same brief window of time. The same week that produced an easy, familiar laugh with Priscilla also produced a startlingly direct admission of personal difficulty to a complete stranger. Two very different emotional registers existing simultaneously within his final days, each equally real, each offering its own specific documented glimpse into exactly where he stood emotionally as his life moved toward its unexpected, rapidly approaching end. A different conversation occurring around this same general period would carry an even more direct, unsettling weight, this time delivered not to a stranger, but to someone who had known him his entire life. The "I won't ever see you again."
I've been trying to communicate the messages that Elvis instilled in me as the young apprentice. In Conversations with the King, Journals of a Young Apprentice.
2 days before Elvis Presley died, his stepbrother David Stanley heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his own life. David Stanley had grown up alongside Elvis from childhood, the son of Dee Stanley, who married Vernon Presley in 1960. This blended family arrangement placed David, along with his brothers Billy and Ricky, directly inside Presley's orbit throughout their formative years, eventually leading several of the Stanley brothers into working roles within Presley's broader security and household operation as adults. This lifelong closeness meant David occupied a position of genuine, deep familiarity with Presley, the kind of relationship built across decades of shared family life rather than professional proximity alone. When Presley spoke to him, even cryptically, David had the context and history necessary to recognize when something in his stepbrother's words carried unusual weight. According to David Stanley's own account, given later to the British publication The Express, Presley told him directly, 2 days before his death, that he would not ever see him again. "The next time I see you," Presley reportedly said, "will be in a higher place, in a different plane." This statement stands apart sharply from the other documented final conversations from this same period. Priscilla's call carried warmth and familiar humor. The Leo Sayer call carried genuine vulnerability and an explicit acknowledgement of personal struggle. David Stanley's account carries something else entirely, language that sounds, in retrospect, like a direct, conscious farewell, delivered with enough clarity and specificity that David remembered the exact phrasing well enough to repeat it accurately decades later. Understanding how to interpret this statement requires placing it within the broader context of Presley's final 2 years. Multiple accounts from people close to him during this period describe a man who had grown increasingly preoccupied with questions of faith, mortality, and what exists beyond death. Books about the Shroud of Turin and spiritual texts had become a significant part of his reading material. Larry Geller, who had served for years as a kind of spiritual advisor and confidant, spoke extensively about Presley's deepening engagement with these exact questions during his final years. Within this broader context, David Stanley's account does not necessarily represent some unprecedented, isolated premonition. It fits within an established pattern of Presley increasingly discussing death, faith, and what might exist beyond ordinary physical life. Conversations that had apparently become more frequent and more direct as his final months progressed. What makes this specific statement to David Stanley particularly significant is its directness and its timing. 2 days before his actual death, Presley made what reads, even accounting for his broader spiritual preoccupations during this period, as an unusually direct and personal statement specifically addressed to someone who would carry and remember those exact words for the rest of his own life. David Stanley has discussed this memory publicly on various occasions over the decades since, generally framing it with the same weight and seriousness it apparently carried for him personally at the time. He has not claimed certainty about whether Presley possessed some genuine premonition of his own approaching death, or whether the statement instead reflected the broader, ongoing spiritual and philosophical preoccupations that had defined so much of his final 2 years. What David has consistently maintained is the accuracy of the statement itself, the specific words Presley actually used, regardless of how those words should ultimately be interpreted. This distinction matters considerably to how this particular account should be understood within the broader collection of final conversations from this period. It would be easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to treat this statement as clear evidence that Presley somehow knew his death was imminent. The more careful, evidence-based interpretation suggests something different. A man genuinely preoccupied with mortality and spiritual questions throughout his final 2 years, who happened to express that ongoing preoccupation with unusual directness and specificity just 2 days before his actual death. A coincidence in timing, rather than necessarily evidence of genuine foreknowledge. This interpretation does not diminish the genuine emotional weight the statement carried for David Stanley personally, both in the moment and across the following decades. Whether or not Presley possessed any actual premonition, David was left holding words that, once his stepbrother actually died only 2 days later, took on a significance and weight that would have been impossible to anticipate when the conversation itself originally occurred. This pattern, ordinary statements taking on extraordinary retrospective weight once a sudden death follows shortly afterward, appears consistently across nearly every documented final conversation from Presley's last days. Priscilla's call became significant specifically because of how rarely she had heard him laugh recently. The Leo Sayer call became significant because of how directly it contradicted his careful public image. David Stanley's account became significant because of how directly its language anticipated, whether consciously or coincidentally, exactly what would happen only 48 hours later. None of these individual conversations, examined in complete isolation, would necessarily stand out as obviously significant if Presley had simply continued living for years afterward, the way countless similar conversations occur constantly between people who eventually go on to live full, ordinary lives for decades. It is specifically the proximity to his actual sudden death that transforms each of these otherwise unremarkable exchanges into moments people have carried and repeated carefully for nearly 5 decades since. For David Stanley specifically, carrying these particular words for the remainder of his own life created a different kind of weight than what either Priscilla or Leo Sayer experienced from their own final conversations. He had been told, directly and specifically, that he would not see his stepbrother again. 2 days later, that statement proved entirely devastatingly accurate. A different kind of final exchange awaited Vernon Presley, Elvis's own father, who would carry his own brief, almost mundane final conversation with his son for the remaining 2 years of his own life. A conversation notable specifically for how ordinary and unremarkable it sounded in the moment it actually occurred. The more the merrier. Vernon Presley's final conversation with his son carried none of the spiritual weight of David Stanley's account, none of the open vulnerability Leo Sayer encountered, none of the easy nostalgic warmth Priscilla remembered. It was, by Vernon's own description, almost entirely ordinary, a small, practical exchange about an upcoming tour. According to Vernon's own account, given to the commercial appeal just days after his son's death, the conversation happened sometime during that final evening, the same general stretch of hours that included the racquetball game, the piano session, and the various other small moments that have since become carefully documented pieces of Presley's final day. Vernon told his son something simple and practical. "I think I'll just go with you on this tour," he said. Elvis's response came back equally simple, equally unremarkable in the moment it was spoken. "Fine," he said, "the more the merrier." This brief exchange represents, by Vernon's own account, the final words that passed between father and son before everything changed the following afternoon. There was no foreshadowing in the words themselves, no hidden weight or unusual phrasing. Just two family members discussing ordinary travel logistics, the kind of small, practical conversation that happens constantly within families without anyone pausing to consider its significance. This ordinariness carries its own particular weight, specifically because of how starkly it contrasts with David Stanley's considerably more dramatic account from roughly the same general period. Two people, both close to Presley, both speaking with him during these final days, walked away with entirely different kinds of final memories. One carried words that sounded, in retrospect, like a deliberate, conscious farewell. The other carried words so mundane and practical that their only significance came entirely from the timing that followed them. Vernon's interview, conducted just days after burying his only child, reveals a father working through almost unbearable grief, while still managing the practical and public demands suddenly placed upon him. He described, in that same conversation, watching paramedics arrive within minutes of being told something had happened upstairs. "Joe called me between 2:15 and 2:30 in the afternoon," he said, "and told me I should come upstairs because something had happened. I went upstairs, and we started giving Elvis mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but I thought it was probably too late. I looked at Elvis and I realized it was probably a helpless situation, but it was so hard to believe it had happened." This account, combined with his memory of their final, simple exchange about the tour, reveals the particular kind of grief Vernon carried throughout the remainder of his own life. He did not have dramatic final words to hold on to, no clear, meaningful farewell exchanged with foreknowledge of what was coming. He had instead an entirely ordinary conversation about travel plans, the kind that could have happened on any other evening throughout the preceding years, except that this particular evening happened to be the last one. Vernon also discussed, in this same interview, a separate conversation Elvis reportedly had with his aunt, Mrs. Biggs, earlier that same day. She took Elvis some water and the morning newspaper as he relaxed in his room around 8:30 that morning, Vernon explained. He told her he was going to get up that night and then leave around 11:30 or midnight for the tour, which was scheduled to open in Portland, Maine, the following night. He was happy and walking around talking about the upcoming tour. He was in a jovial and happy mood. This detail reinforces something significant about the broader emotional texture of Presley's final days specifically, as opposed to the more troubled, vulnerable tone present in his earlier conversation with Leo Sayer just days before. Whatever difficulty he had been experiencing and openly acknowledging to a stranger earlier that week, his final day itself, by every account from people who interacted with him directly, showed someone in genuinely good spirits, looking forward to the upcoming tour, engaged and present with the people around him. This apparent shift from the openly struggling man who called Leo Sayer earlier that week to the jovial, happy man Mrs. Biggs and Vernon both described on his actual final day complicates any attempt to construct a single, simple emotional narrative covering his entire final week. People, even people carrying genuine, significant burdens, do not experience uniform, unchanging emotional states across every single day. Some days carry more visible struggle. Others carry more visible lightness. Presley's final week, pieced together through these various separate accounts, reflects exactly this kind of genuine human variation, rather than a single, steadily building arc toward an inevitable, foreshadowed ending. For Vernon specifically, this variation mattered enormously to how he processed his son's death in the years that followed. He had buried a son who had, by every account from that final day itself, seemed happy and engaged, looking forward to returning to work, discussing simple, ordinary plans about an upcoming tour with no apparent awareness that anything unusual was approaching. The conversation about joining the tour, the more the merrier, represented for Vernon a small, genuine piece of ordinary connection preserved from his son's final hours, even as it offered none of the deeper, more dramatic significance some of the other documented final conversations from that same general period seemed to carry. This is perhaps the most honest and complete picture available from examining these various accounts together. Presley's final days contain genuine struggle, genuine spiritual reflection, genuine warmth, and genuine, completely ordinary moments, all existing simultaneously within the same compressed window of time, none of them canceling out or fully explaining the others. A final conversation occurring in the very last hours before his death would add one more piece to this complicated, multifaceted picture, this time delivered to the cousin and friend who had played racquetball alongside him only hours before everything changed. The "I love you."
She called me about somewhere around 1:45 and said they had taken him to the hospital.
In the early morning hours of August the 16th, 1977, Elvis Presley spoke his actual final documented words to two people who had known him for most of his life: his cousin Billy Smith and Billy's wife, Jo. Billy Smith had grown up alongside Elvis, part of the same close-knit Presley family network that had shaped so much of Elvis's earliest years. By the final period of Presley's life, Billy occupied a position of genuine, lifelong trust. Someone Presley called on not for professional reasons, but for the simple, enduring comfort of family closeness during difficult, late-night hours when sleep would not come easily. According to the detailed timeline, reconstructed through multiple accounts, Presley called Billy at approximately 4 in the morning, asking him and Jo to come over to Graceland for a game of racquetball. This request fit within an established, familiar pattern from his final years' late-night activity. Physical exertion sought out during hours when most of the world slept. A small attempt to burn through restless energy before eventually settling into whatever sleep his medication routine would eventually provide. Billy and Jo arrived, and the small group played racquetball together on the court Presley had built on the Graceland property. Ginger Alden joined as well during portions of this activity. The game itself proceeded much as similar late-night sessions had for months, Presley moving with noticeably less energy than in earlier years, according to Billy's own later recollections, though still genuinely present and engaged, taking breaks more frequently than had once been typical. Following the game, the group moved into the music room adjoining the racquetball court. Presley sat at the piano and began to play the way he so often did during these late-night hours when the conversation and physical activity gave way to something quieter and more reflective. He played Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain, followed by 2 gospel songs, the deep foundational musical tradition that had shaped him since childhood in Tupelo. This detail, the specific songs chosen during what would become his final musical performance of any kind, has drawn particular attention from those who have studied this final night closely. Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain, a song about loss and parting, carries an almost unbearable retrospective weight once placed against what would happen only hours later. Though nothing in the available record suggests Presley selected it with any conscious awareness of its eventual significance. He simply played the music that came naturally to him during these quiet, contemplative late-night hours, the same way he had on countless similar nights throughout the preceding years. Around 5 in the morning, the gathering wound down. Presley and Ginger retired toward the bedroom. Billy and Jo prepared to head home, their visit, like so many similar late-night visits before it, drawing naturally to its close as the early morning hours stretched toward dawn. It was at this point, according to Billy and Jo's own account, shared directly in an interview years later with the YouTube channel EFM, Elvis Fans Matter, that Presley spoke his final words to them. Simple, direct, and warm. "I love you," he told them both. The kind of straightforward, affectionate farewell that had likely passed between them countless times before across their entire shared lifetime of family closeness.
Neither Billy nor Joe had any reason in that specific moment to treat these words as anything other than completely ordinary. Family members say "I love you" to each other constantly at the end of countless unremarkable visits, without any expectation that the words carry special significance beyond simple, genuine affection. It was only in retrospect, once Presley was found unresponsive approximately 8 hours later, that these particular words took on the weight of being his actual, final documented statement to anyone close to him. This timeline detail matters significantly to understanding the full shape of that final night. Roughly 8 hours passed between this final exchange with Billy and Joe, and Ginger's eventual discovery of Presley's body in the bathroom. During this gap, Presley retreated to read, carrying with him the now well-documented stack of books, including material about the Shroud of Turin, before the medical crisis that would end his life occurred sometime within those following hours, likely closer to the beginning of that gap than the end of it. Based on the medical evidence reviewed extensively elsewhere in broader examinations of his final timeline, Billy and Joe Smith have carried this specific memory, the racquetball game, the piano session, the simple warm farewell, for nearly 5 decades since. Their account, when finally shared more fully in detail through later interviews, completed the picture of Presley's final hours with a level of warmth and ordinary family closeness that stands in meaningful contrast to the more clinical, medical details that otherwise dominate so much of the historical record surrounding his death. Taken together with the other documented final conversations from this same general period, Priscilla's call and the laugh she had been hearing, less often, Leo Sayers' unexpected window into genuine personal struggle, David Stanley's unsettling, almost prophetic farewell, Vernon's small, practical exchange about joining the tour, and now Billy and Joe's simple, warm goodbye. A considerably fuller and more complicated picture emerges than any single account could provide alone. These were not 5 separate isolated final words delivered with conscious awareness of their eventual significance. They were 5 entirely ordinary conversations, each reflecting a genuine, specific dimension of who Presley actually was during these final days. Struggling and laughing, reflective and practical, spiritual and simply, warmly affectionate with the family members who had known him his entire life. It was only the sudden, unexpected ending that followed shortly afterward that transformed each of these unremarkable exchanges into something people would carry, repeat, and carefully preserve for nearly 5 decades. Searching within entirely ordinary words for whatever meaning and connection they could still find to a man whose actual final days looked far more human and far more complicated than any single simplified story could ever fully capture. An ordinary week, full of small goodbyes. Placed together, the 5 documented conversations from Elvis Presley's final days do not form a single, coherent story, building steadily toward an inevitable, foreshadowed ending. They form something messier and considerably more honest. An ordinary week lived by an ordinary man carrying extraordinary fame, who happened, by simple coincidence of timing, to have several of his final conversations preserved and remembered with unusual clarity by the specific people who shared them. Priscilla's call captured warmth and familiar humor, a laugh she specifically noted she had been hearing less often, offering a brief glimpse of the easier, lighter version of him that had grown rarer across his difficult final years. The conversation cost nothing, demanded nothing, and meant everything precisely because of how unremarkable it felt while it was actually happening. 2 people who had once been husband and wife, talking easily about a manager's old promotional habits, laughing the way old friends laugh at jokes only they fully understand. Leo Sayers' call captured something rawer, a direct, unguarded admission of personal struggle offered to a complete stranger, evidence that whatever burden Presley was carrying during this period, he remained capable of reaching outward for connection rather than retreating entirely into isolation. This detail matters considerably when weighed against the broader historical record of his final 2 years, much of which emphasizes withdrawal, suspicion, and growing distance from the people around him. The Sayer call complicates that narrative meaningfully, showing a man still willing, even in his most difficult moments, to pick up a phone and ask a near stranger for exactly the kind of creative energy and human connection he felt was missing.
David Stanley's account captured language that reads, in retrospect, as startlingly direct, whether genuine premonition or simply the continuation of months of growing spiritual preoccupation, finally finding unusually clear expression. Of all 5 conversations, this one carries the heaviest interpretive burden, the one most tempting to read as deliberate foreshadowing rather than coincidence. The honest, careful conclusion resists that temptation, situating the statement instead within Presley's well-documented broader fascination with mortality and faith during this period, a preoccupation that had been building for months before this specific conversation, rather than arriving suddenly and uniquely in these final 2 days. Vernon's account captured the opposite, an entirely ordinary, practical exchange about tour logistics, proof that even amid whatever deeper struggles existed, daily life continued in its small, unremarkable way right up until the very end. This conversation, more than any other, illustrates how little warning typically precedes sudden, unexpected death. A father and son discussing travel plans. Nothing more. The kind of conversation that happens countless times within any family, remembered afterward not because of anything said, but simply because of what happened next. And Billy and Joe's account captured perhaps the simplest, most universally human moment of all. A warm, genuine, "I love you" exchange between family members at the end of an ordinary late-night visit, following a racquetball game and a quiet piano session that, in any other circumstance, would have been forgotten within days, indistinguishable from dozens of similar evenings that had come before it. No single one of these conversations tells the complete story. Together, they resist the kind of clean, simplified narrative that popular retellings of famous deaths often impose retroactively. The idea that warning signs should have been obvious, that someone should have recognized what was coming, that a man's final words should somehow have matched the magnitude of what followed them. The actual record shows something far more true to how real lives and real deaths typically unfold. Genuine variation, genuine ordinariness existing alongside genuine struggle. Significant moments that nobody recognized as significant until afterward, simply because nobody ever does, in the moment, recognize an ordinary Tuesday conversation as someone's actual final words. This pattern extends a broader truth about how sudden death transforms memory generally, not just in Presley's specific famous case, but in the far more common, private experience of anyone who has lost someone unexpectedly. The mind searches backward instinctively for meaning and warning in conversations that, at the time, carried none. A good night becomes significant only because no other good night followed it. A laugh becomes precious only because it turned out to be among the last. An ordinary exchange about tour plans becomes treasured only because death intervened before any more meaningful conversation had the chance to occur. For the people who shared these 5 conversations, the weight each now carries says as much about grief and memory generally as it does about Presley specifically. Priscilla holding on to a laugh across decades of retelling. Leo Sayer doubting his own memory for years before finally receiving unexpected confirmation over an unrelated dinner. David Stanley carrying words that sounded almost immediately like prophecy, words he has repeated carefully and consistently across every subsequent interview addressing that final week. Vernon holding on to the smallest, most practical exchange imaginable, simply because it was what he actually had. All he could offer when reporters asked him, just days into his grief, what his son's final words to him had actually been. Billy and Joe treasuring 3 ordinary words that needed no embellishment to carry genuine, lasting meaning, words simple enough that they required no interpretation at all. What these 5 accounts ultimately offer, when considered honestly and together, is not a hidden mystery finally solved, nor a clear warning that should have been heeded. They offer something more valuable and considerably more human. A fuller, more complete picture of an ordinary final week lived by a man who was, in these last documented moments, still capable of humor, still capable of vulnerability, still capable of spiritual reflection, still capable of simple, practical conversation, and still capable, in his very last words to the people who loved him, of nothing more complicated or profound than telling them directly that he loved them. That ordinariness, more than any dramatic revelation, may be the truest thing these conversations actually reveal. 5 conversations, none of them recognized as significant until it was already too late. Elvis Presley's final words were not profound or prophetic. They were simply human, ordinary, and real.